Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Warning. Marshall Noble had always trusted his instincts. 15 years as a Navy SEAL, followed by a decade running his own security consulting firm, had taught him to read situations and people with surgical precision. But nothing had prepared him for the trembling man at his front door on what should have been the beginning of his family's new chapter. "You need to leave this house immediately," Eugene Tompkins whispered, his weathered hands shaking as he gripped the doorframe. The 60-something neighbor's eyes darted nervously between Marshall and the street behind him. Marshall instinctively positioned himself to shield his 6-year-old son, Adam, who was playing with toy soldiers in the hallway. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice calm but alert. "Bring your daughter and come to my second floor. Now, please." Eugene's urgency cut through the evening air like a blade. Marshall's wife Jenny appeared from the kitchen, their 8-year-old daughter Beth beside her. Jenny's nursing background had taught her to recognize genuine distress, and Eugene's pallor told her everything she needed to know. "Marshall," she questioned. "Take the kids," Marshall said quietly. "Follow Mr. Tompkins." The short walk to Eugene's house felt eternal. Marshall's tactical mind cataloged every shadow, every parked car, every potential threat. Eugene led them upstairs to a bedroom window that faced their new property. "Look," Eugene whispered, pointing toward their house. Marshall stepped to the window and felt his blood freeze. In the fading daylight, he could see figures positioned strategically around his property. At least 6 men with what appeared to be firearms, moving with military precision. His new home was surrounded. Jenny gasped beside him, instinctively pulling their children closer. Marshall's knees buckled as the full realization hit him. Someone had been waiting for them. This wasn't random. "Who are they?" Marshall asked, his SEAL training overriding his shock. Eugene's voice cracked. "Vernon Butler's men. You're the 5th family to move into that house in 3 years. The others, they left quickly. The smart ones anyway. Vernon Butler owns half the businesses in town. The other half pay him protection money. That house." Eugene swallowed hard. "He wants it bad. Real bad." Marshall's mind raced. He bought the house because of its strategic location, elevated position, clear sight lines, easily defensible. Now he understood why it had been priced so attractively. The previous owners, Marshall said, pieces clicking together. What happened to them? Eugene looked away. The Meltons. Nice family. After their house caught fire while they were sleeping, they decided to sell. The family before that had their car brakes mysteriously fail. The one before that. He trailed off. Jenny's grip tightened on the children. "We need to call the police." Eugene laughed bitterly. Sheriff Damon Espinoza graduated high school with Vernon. His nephew Brad Phelps runs the only tow truck service in town. His brother-in-law Stanley McCall owns the insurance company that'll investigate any claims you might file. Marshall's jaw clenched. A network. Butler had built a network of corruption that made him untouchable through conventional means. But Marshall Noble wasn't conventional. "How long have you lived here, Eugene?" Marshall asked. 23 years. Bought this place right after my discharge from Vietnam. I watched this town rot from the inside out because of Vernon Butler. "Why haven't you left?" Eugene's eyes hardened. "This is my home. My wife's buried in the cemetery down the road. I won't be run off by some tin pot dictator and his thugs." Marshall studied the older man. There was steel beneath the fear, the kind forged in combat and tempered by loss. "What does Butler want with my house specifically?" "The land. Your property sits directly above the old mining tunnels that connect to his operations. Word is he's using them to move questionable cargo. Your house is the only thing blocking his complete control of the area." As if summoned by their conversation, Marshall watched 3 black SUVs pull up to their house. A tall, imposing figure stepped out of the lead vehicle. Even from this distance, Marshall could see the man commanded respect and fear from his subordinates. "That's him," Eugene confirmed. "Vernon Butler himself." Marshall watched Butler survey the property with proprietary satisfaction. The man moved like he owned everything he touched, and by all accounts, he did. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd threatened Marshall Noble's family. Eugene, Marshall said quietly, "How badly do you want Vernon Butler gone?" The older man's eyes sharpened. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking a man who's built his empire on fear and intimidation has probably made a lot of enemies. I'm thinking someone with my background might be able to help those enemies find their backbone." Jenny turned to study her husband's profile. She'd seen that look before, the cold calculation that had made him legendary among his SEAL team. "Marshall, we could just leave. Find another house." "No." Marshall's voice carried finality. "Running for bullies only encourages them. Besides, this is our home now. We're not leaving." As they watched, Butler's men began to withdraw, but not before one of them spray-painted something on their front door. Even from this distance, the message was clear, a warning. "They'll be back," Eugene said. "I'm counting on it," Marshall replied, his mind already working through possibilities. "Eugene, I'm going to need detailed information about Butler's operation. Everything you know. You really think you can take him down?" Marshall's smile was predatory. "Mr. Tompkins, Vernon Butler has controlled this town through fear because no one's ever fought back properly. He's about to learn the difference between intimidating civilians and threatening a warrior." The pieces were already falling into place in Marshall's mind. Butler thought he was dealing with another frightened family. Instead, he declared war on someone who'd spent his entire adult life preparing for exactly this kind of fight. As they watched Butler's convoy disappear into the night, Marshall was already planning his counterattack. Chapter 2, Reconnaissance. The next morning, Marshall dropped Jenny and the kids at her sister's house 2 towns over. "How long will you be gone?" Jenny asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. "As long as it takes," Marshall replied, kissing her forehead. "Butler made this personal when he threatened our family. I won't let that stand." Back in town, Marshall began his reconnaissance. His first stop was the local diner, where small-town intelligence gathering was an art form. He slid into a booth across from Krista, the middle-aged waitress whose knowing eyes suggested she'd seen everything this town had to offer. "You're the new guy," she said, pouring coffee without being asked. "Heard you had some excitement last night." Word travels fast. In a town this size, breathing travels fast. Krista glanced around, then leaned closer. "You seem different from the others. Less breakable." "Others?" "The families who try to live in your house. Nice people, but soft. City soft. You got different eyes." Marshall studied her. "What do you know about Vernon Butler?" Krista's expression didn't change, but her voice dropped. "I know he owns the building this diner sits in. I know my lease comes up for renewal next month. I know accidents happen to people who talk too much. But sometimes a girl gets tired of being afraid." She slipped him a folded napkin. "That's everything I can give you. Use it wisely." Marshall pocketed the napkin and left a generous tip. Outside, he unfolded it to find an address and a time. Warehouse District, Building 7, midnight. His next stop was the library, where he researched property records and city planning documents. What he found painted a disturbing picture. Over the past 5 years, Butler had systematically acquired nearly every piece of commercial real estate in town. The few holdouts had suffered mysterious accidents, fires, or bankruptcies. But it was the historical mining surveys that caught Marshall's attention. Eugene had been right about the tunnels. They formed an extensive network that ran beneath half the town, with his house sitting at a crucial junction. If Butler was using them for smuggling, Marshall's property was the key to the entire operation. That evening, Marshall visited the cemetery where Eugene's wife was buried. He found the older man there, placing fresh flowers on a weathered headstone. "Sarah would have liked your Jenny," Eugene said without looking up. "She always said this town needed someone willing to fight back." "Tell me about Butler's operation," Marshall said. "The real story." Eugene straightened, his military bearing returning. "Started small about 15 years ago. Protection racket, mostly. But then the factory closed and people got desperate. Butler offered jobs, security work, transportation, no questions asked. Good money for folks who didn't have many options. Drugs, that's what everyone assumes. But I think it's bigger. The tunnels connect to the old river access point, perfect for bringing in cargo from the water. And the timing of his shipments coincides with certain political events. Marshall's blood chilled. You think he's trafficking people? Eugene nodded grimly. Young women, mostly. Foreign nationals. The kind who won't be missed if they disappear. The magnitude of Butler's operation crystallized in Marshall's mind. This wasn't just about intimidation or real estate. It was about human lives. Women being traded like commodities through the very tunnels beneath his children's bedrooms. Who else knows? Marshall asked. A few people suspect, but proving it is another matter. Sheriff Espinoza isn't just corrupt, he's complicit. Half the town council is on Butler's payroll. The FBI field office is understaffed and overwhelmed with bigger cases in the cities. What about federal marshals? Eugene shook his head. Butler's careful. Keeps everything compartmentalized. His men don't know the full scope, and those who do know are too scared or too well paid to talk. That night, Marshall made his way to Building 7 in the warehouse district. The structure loomed against the sky like a concrete monument to decay. He approached carefully, every sense alert for ambush. Inside, he found Amber Mayer waiting in the shadows. The 30-something woman's professional attire couldn't hide the haunted look in her eyes. You're Marshall Noble, she said. It wasn't a question. You have information about Butler. I used to be his accountant, before I developed a conscience. Amber's voice carried years of regret. I can give you names, dates, financial records. Everything you need to understand how deep this goes. Why now? Because last week, I watched them unload a shipment that included a girl who couldn't have been more than 16. She looked like my daughter. Amber's hands shook as she handed him a flash drive. I've been documenting everything for months, waiting for someone who could actually do something with it. Marshall pocketed the drive. This implicates you too. I know, but I can't live with myself if I do nothing. Butler thinks he's untouchable because he's always 3 steps ahead of the law. Maybe it's time someone played by different rules. As Marshall left the warehouse, his mind was already processing the intelligence. Butler's network was extensive, but like all criminal enterprises, it had vulnerabilities. The man's arrogance was the biggest one. He'd built his empire on the assumption that no one would ever fight back effectively. But Marshall Noble wasn't just anyone. And Vernon Butler was about to learn what happened when someone with his particular set of skills decided to go to war. Chapter 3. The Network Revealed. The flash drive contained a roadmap to Butler's empire. And as Marshall studied the files in Eugene's basement, the scope of the corruption became staggering. Vernon Butler hadn't just bought a town. He'd systematically dismantled every institution that could threaten him. Look at this, Marshall said, pointing to a series of financial transfers. Butler's been funding Sheriff Espinoza's department for 3 years. New equipment, salary supplements, even college tuition for deputies' kids. Eugene leaned over the laptop screen, creating loyalty through dependency. Smart. It gets worse. Marshall scrolled through more documents. Mayor Beth Mays, city council members Reuben Fitzgerald and Heidi Fletcher, even Judge Herman Hodge, they're all receiving payments through shell companies Butler controls. The whole system's compromised. Marshall nodded grimly. But here's what's interesting. Amber documented everything, including Butler's biggest weakness. He opened a series of shipping manifests and financial records. Butler's operation runs on a strict schedule. Every 3rd Wednesday, he moves his highest value cargo through the tunnels. Next shipment is in 5 days. Human trafficking? According to these records, yes. But also something else. Marshall highlighted a series of coded entries. Amber included a note here. Butler's been moving military-grade weapons to domestic terror groups. We're not just talking about local corruption. This is federal terrorism charges. Eugene's face hardened. That explains why he needs complete control of the tunnel network. Your house isn't just convenient. It's essential for operational security. Marshall's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. We have your family's new address. 48 hours to vacate permanently, or they'll learn what happened to the Meltons. VB. The message included photos of Jenny and the kids at her sister's house. Marshall's expression went arctic. He just made his final mistake. What do you mean? Butler's been playing chess while I've been learning the board. Now it's time to flip the table. Marshall stood, his mind shifting into full tactical mode. Eugene, I need you to contact everyone in this town who's ever been hurt by Butler. Every victim, every family member, everyone who's lost something to his operation. What are you planning? Butler thinks he controls this town because he owns the systems. But he forgot something important. Systems can be turned against their masters. Marshall spent the next day conducting careful surveillance of Butler's operation. The man kept regular hours, splitting his time between a legitimate construction company downtown and a private estate on the outskirts of town. His security detail consisted of 8 men, rotating in shifts of 4. But it was Butler's evening routine that caught Marshall's attention. Every night at 9 p.m., he visited a specific location, a small house on the north side of town where an elderly woman lived alone. Following at a distance, Marshall watched Butler enter the house with a bouquet of flowers. The interaction seemed genuine, personal. When Butler emerged an hour later, his usual arrogant demeanor was replaced by something softer. A quick property records search revealed the house belonged to Wanda Ramos, age 73. More digging uncovered the connection. She was Butler's mother. The discovery changed everything. For all his power and ruthlessness, Vernon Butler was still someone's son. And in Marshall's experience, even the most dangerous predators became vulnerable when their family was involved. That evening, Marshall met with Eugene and 3 other townspeople in the church basement. Amber Mayer was there along with Deb Delgado, whose husband had died in a suspicious construction accident on one of Butler's job sites, and Glenn Red, who'd lost his hardware store when Butler suddenly called in alone. I want to be clear about what I'm proposing, Marshall began. We're going to bring down Butler's entire operation. But it won't be easy, and it won't be without risk. What kind of risk? Glenn asked. The kind where people might get hurt. Butler's not going to go quietly, and he's got resources we don't. But he also has vulnerabilities we can exploit. Marshall laid out the intelligence he'd gathered. Butler's next major shipment is in 4 days. If we can intercept it and document what he's moving, we'll have evidence that even his corrupt local contacts can't suppress. The FBI? Deb asked. Better. I've got contacts in military intelligence who specialize in domestic terrorism. Once they see what Butler's really moving, they'll bring down the full weight of federal law enforcement. And if Butler retaliates before then? Amber questioned. Marshall's smile was cold. He won't get the chance, because we're going to hit him where he doesn't expect it, through his blind spot, which is his mother. The group exchanged uncertain glances. Eugene spoke first. Marshall, I'm willing to do a lot to stop Butler, but involving an innocent old woman. Not involving, Marshall corrected. Protecting. Butler's been keeping his mother isolated and controlled. What if she learned the truth about her son's business? What if she had protection and support to speak out? The plan was audacious. While Butler prepared for his next shipment, thinking his show of force had cowed Marshall into submission, they would be dismantling his network from within, starting with the one person whose opinion might actually matter to him. There's something else, Marshall added. I'm done playing defense. Butler threatened my family, your families, this entire community. It's time he learned what real consequences look like. As the meeting broke up, each member of their small group had specific assignments. Eugene would coordinate with other potential allies. Amber would continue documenting Butler's financial activities. Deb and Glenn would help spread word quietly among Butler's victims. And Marshall would begin the most dangerous part of the plan, getting close to Vernon Butler's mother without alerting Butler's security network. The war had begun in earnest. Butler had spent years believing his power made him untouchable. He was about to discover that predators become prey when someone with superior skills decides to hunt them. Chapter 4. The Counterstrike. Marshall's first move came at dawn. Using skills honed in countless covert operations, he approached Wanda Ramos's house through the overgrown garden behind her property. The elderly woman was tending to her roses, her movements careful but determined. Mrs. Ramos? Marshall called softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, revealing intelligent eyes and a weathered face. You're not one of Vernon's boys, she said, her voice carrying surprising strength. No, ma'am. I'm Marshall Noble. I live in a house on Elm Street. Recognition flickered in her eyes. The one Vernon's been fussing about. He said you'd be leaving soon. I'm not going anywhere. But I think we should talk about your son's business activities. Wanda studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward her back door. I suppose you'd better come in. And Mr. Noble? I probably know more about my son's business than you think. Inside her modest kitchen, surrounded by photos of a young Vernon in Little League uniforms and graduation caps, Wanda poured coffee with steady hands. 30 years ago, Vernon was a good boy, she began without preamble. Smart, ambitious, but decent. Then his father died, and something changed. The boy who used to rescue stray cats started hurting people for money. You know what he's involved in? I'm 73, not blind. I know my son controls this town through fear. I know people disappear when they cross him. I know he visits me every evening, so I'll keep believing he's still that good boy underneath. Her voice cracked slightly. But mothers see everything, Mr. Noble, even when they wish they couldn't. Marshall leaned forward. Mrs. Ramos, what would you say if I told you your son is involved in human trafficking? That young women are being moved through tunnels under this town? Wanda's cup rattled against its saucer. I'd say it's worse than I feared, but not more than I suspected. She stood, walking to a window that faced toward town. Every Wednesday night, Vernon comes here agitated. Paces my living room, mutters about shipments and deadlines. He thinks I'm too old to understand. Would you be willing to help stop him? Mr. Noble, I've been praying for 20 years that someone would stop my son before he destroyed himself completely. But I'm one old woman. What could I possibly do? Marshall's tactical mind was already working. More than you know. Your son's greatest strength is also his weakness. No one in his organization questions his judgment because they're too afraid. But you're the one person whose opinion actually matters to him. Before Wanda could respond, Marshall's phone buzzed with an urgent text from Eugene. Butler's men are moving. Multiple vehicles heading toward your location. Marshall was already moving toward the back door when the sound of engines reached them. Mrs. Ramos, do you have somewhere safe you can go? This is my home. I won't be driven out. Then we do this the hard way. Marshall quickly assessed the house's defensive positions. The kitchen window provided clear sight lines to the backyard, while the front door was solid oak, good for buying time. 3 black SUVs pulled into Wanda's driveway, disgorging 6 armed men. Marshall recognized the lead figure as Kenny Nicholson, one of Butler's lieutenants he'd identified from surveillance photos. Marshall Noble, Nicholson called out. You've got 30 seconds to come out before we come in. Stay down, Marshall whispered to Wanda, who had positioned herself behind the kitchen counter with surprising composure. Mr. Noble, she whispered back, there's something you should know. Vernon's not the only one in the family with military training. His father didn't just die. He was killed in action. Special forces. And some of what he taught his son, he taught me too. Marshall stared at her with new respect as she produced a pistol from beneath the counter, a well-maintained .38 special that she clearly knew how to use. 20 seconds, Nicholson shouted. Marshall's mind raced through options. Direct confrontation wasn't ideal with Mrs. Ramos present, but Butler's men had made the first aggressive move. That changed the rules of engagement. Mrs. Ramos, can you handle yourself if this gets ugly? Son, I've been handling myself since before you were born. Marshall smiled grimly and moved to the front window. Nicholson, tell your boss that threatening old ladies isn't a good look, even for him. You're trespassing on private property, Noble. Mr. Butler owns this house. That was news to Marshall. A quick glance at Wanda confirmed his suspicion. She looked surprised too. Butler had apparently been making moves his own mother didn't know about. Actually, Wanda called out loudly enough to be heard outside. This house belongs to me, Kenny Nicholson. It's been in my family for 40 years. And you're not welcome here. Marshall saw uncertainty flicker across Nicholson's face. Butler's men were used to intimidating strangers, not confronting the boss's mother. Ma'am, with respect, Mr. Butler said. I don't care what Vernon said. This is still my house, and you're still trespassing. Marshall seized the moment of confusion. You boys might want to check with Butler before you do something stupid. I'm betting he didn't authorize you to threaten his mother. The tactical situation shifted as Nicholson realized he was caught between conflicting orders. Butler had clearly sent them to intimidate Marshall, but confronting Mrs. Ramos directly would create problems with their boss. After a tense standoff, Nicholson's phone rang. Marshall could see the man's expression change as he listened to Butler's voice on the other end. "Fall back," Nicholson ordered his men. "But Noble, this isn't over." As the SUVs departed, Marshall turned to find Wanda calmly returning her pistol to its hiding place. "Mrs. Ramos, I think we need to talk about exactly what kind of help you're willing to provide." Her eyes hardened with resolve. "Whatever it takes to stop my son from becoming a monster, Mr. Noble. Whatever it takes." Marshall realized he'd found more than just an ally. He'd found someone with both the motivation and the access to bring down Butler's empire from within. The war was about to shift dramatically in their favor. Chapter 5: Building the Alliance. The abandoned grain silo on the outskirts of town had been empty for 15 years, making it perfect for clandestine meetings. Marshall arrived first, using thermal imaging equipment borrowed from his security consulting days to ensure they weren't being monitored. One by one, his allies arrived. Eugene came first, followed by Amber with a briefcase full of additional financial records. Deb Delgado brought her brother-in-law Josh Ramsey, a former state trooper who'd been forced into early retirement after refusing to ignore Butler's activities. Glenn Redd arrived with surprising reinforcement. Meredith Stokes, the town librarian who turned out to have a master's degree in criminal justice and an extensive knowledge of federal law enforcement procedures. The last to arrive was Wanda Ramos, moving carefully but determinedly through the silo's entrance. "Before we begin," Marshall said, "everyone needs to understand stakes. Butler knows we're organizing against him. He's going to escalate, which means things are going to get dangerous fast." "How dangerous?" Josh asked. "This morning, someone firebombed Amber's apartment." Marshall replied grimly. "She wasn't there, but the message was clear." Amber nodded, her face pale but resolute. "They left a note saying that's what happens to people who betray Vernon Butler. Which brings us to why we're here," Marshall continued. "Butler's next major shipment is tomorrow night. According to Amber's intelligence, it's his biggest operation yet. A combination of human trafficking victims and weapons bound for domestic terror cells." Meredith spread federal law enforcement organizational charts across the makeshift table. "I've been researching federal jurisdiction. If we can document human trafficking, weapons trafficking, and corruption of local officials, we trigger multiple federal agencies. FBI, ATF, ICE, even Homeland Security. The problem is proof," Josh added. "Butler's been careful to keep everything compartmentalized. His men don't know the full scope, and those who do are too scared to talk." "Which is where I come in," Wanda said quietly. "Vernon still thinks I'm just his dotty old mother. He doesn't know I've been documenting his activities for years." She opened a weathered notebook filled with careful handwriting. "Every Wednesday for the past 3 years, I've recorded the vehicles that arrive at his compound. License plates, number of passengers, descriptions of cargo being unloaded. I even have photos." The group stared in amazement as Wanda produced a digital camera filled with surveillance images that would make a federal investigator weep with joy. "Mrs. Ramos," Marshall said slowly, "you've been conducting a solo investigation this entire time? I couldn't stop my son from becoming a criminal, but I could make sure he'd face justice eventually. I just needed someone capable of using the evidence properly." Eugene grinned with fierce pride. "Sarah always said Wanda was the toughest woman in town." Marshall studied the photographs, clear images of young women being moved in restraints, crates marked with military designations, meetings between Butler and known criminal figures. It was a federal prosecutor's dream case. "This is incredible, but we still have a timing problem," Amber pointed out. "Even if we get this evidence to federal authorities immediately, they'll need time to verify it and build a case. Butler's shipment is tomorrow night." "Not if we intercept it ourselves," Marshall said. "That's extremely dangerous," Josh warned. "Butler's security team is well-armed and experienced. So am I." Marshall's voice carried quiet confidence. The difference is they're expecting to intimidate civilians. They're not prepared for someone who's fought actual wars. Meredith leaned forward. What exactly are you proposing? Marshall moved to a detailed map of the tunnel network he'd drawn based on Amber's intelligence and historical mining surveys. Butler's operation depends on secrecy and controlled access points. But tunnels work both ways. They can trap people as easily as they hide them. He outlined his plan with military precision. The goal wasn't just to intercept Butler's shipment, but to create irrefutable evidence of his criminal enterprise while ensuring the victims were rescued safely. Wanda, you'll need to have dinner with Vernon tomorrow night, as usual. Keep him occupied and away from the operation until it's too late for him to interfere. I can handle Vernon, she said firmly. Eugene and Josh, you'll coordinate with federal contacts. I've got friends in military intelligence who can expedite the process once we have evidence in hand. Deb and Glenn, your job is to document everything. Photos, video, witness statements. We need a paper trail that even Butler's corrupt contacts can't suppress. And you? Amber asked. Marshall's smile was predatory. I'm going hunting. As the meeting broke up, each member of their alliance had specific assignments. But it was Wanda who pulled Marshall aside as they prepared to leave. Mr. Noble, there's something else you should know about Vernon. When he was younger, after his father died, he had what we now call PTSD, violent episodes, paranoia, an obsession with control. I got him help, and he seemed to recover. But lately, you think he's getting worse? I think when you start backing him into a corner, he's going to become unpredictable, dangerous in ways you might not expect. Marshall absorbed this intelligence. A cornered predator with psychological instability was the most dangerous kind of enemy. But it also meant Butler would likely make mistakes that could be exploited. Thank you for the warning, Mrs. Ramos. But I've dealt with unstable hostiles before. The key is staying 3 steps ahead. As Marshall made his way back to town, his mind was already working through contingencies. Butler thought he was fighting a desperate homeowner trying to protect his family. Instead, he was about to face a coordinated operation designed by someone who understood warfare better than he understood fear. The next 24 hours would determine whether justice came to their small town or whether Butler's reign of terror continued unchallenged. Marshall preferred the first option, and he'd learned long ago that what Marshall Noble preferred, Marshall Noble usually got. Chapter 6. Preparation and Betrayal. The morning of Butler's major shipment began with an unexpected complication. Marshall's secure phone rang at 5 a.m. with a familiar voice from his past. Noble, this is Colonel Adam Mueller, Joint Chiefs Intelligence Division. We need to talk. Marshall had worked with Mueller during his final SEAL deployment. The man didn't waste time on social calls. Sir, your name flagged in our system when someone started making inquiries about domestic terror networks in your area. We've been tracking weapons shipments from your region to several hate groups across the Midwest. Marshall felt pieces clicking into place. His intelligence contacts have been faster than expected. Colonel, I may have something relevant to your investigation. I hope so, because there's something you need to know. One of those hate groups is planning an attack on a federal building next week. If we can't trace the weapons back to their source. The weapons are coming through my town. A man named Vernon Butler is coordinating the operation through old mining tunnels. There was a pause. Noble, how the hell do you know that? Marshall briefed Mueller quickly on Butler's operation and their plan to intercept tonight's shipment. The colonel's response was immediate. We're sending a federal task force to your location. ETA, 6 hours. Sir, with respect, that might be too late. Butler's moving the shipment tonight, and if he gets spooked, then we'll miss our best chance to prevent a domestic terror attack. Noble, you're to maintain surveillance only. Do not engage until federal backup arrives. Marshall hung up with mixed feelings. Federal involvement would ensure Butler faced serious charges, but also complicated their carefully planned operation. Worse, it meant waiting 6 more hours while knowing innocent people were trapped in Butler's trafficking network. His contemplation was interrupted by Eugene's frantic voice over their radio frequency. Marshall, we have a problem. Major problem. What's wrong? Deb Delgado's missing. Her car was found abandoned on Route 12 with signs of a struggle. Marshall's blood chilled. Butler was escalating faster than anticipated. Where's her brother-in-law? Josh is searching the area, but Marshall, there's something else. Someone told Butler about our meeting last night. The implications hit Marshall like a physical blow. They had a traitor in their group. How do you know? Because Butler just called the local radio station. He's holding Deb hostage, and he wants to make a trade. Marshall drove to the radio station where a crowd had gathered outside. Through the windows, he could see Butler standing at the microphone, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something more dangerous. Listening out there, noble, so listen carefully. I have Mrs. Delgado in a secure location. She's unharmed for now, but that depends entirely on your cooperation. Butler's voice carried across the town's airwaves with chilling authority. You have 2 hours to present yourself at my compound, alone and unarmed. If you don't, Mrs. Delgado will suffer the same fate as anyone else who interferes with my business. The broadcast ended, leaving an eerie silence across the town. Marshall's tactical mind was already processing options, but they were all complicated by one crucial factor. Butler clearly knew about their investigation, which meant someone had betrayed them. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The librarian has been very informative. Too bad, she won't be answering any more questions. VB. Marshall's heart sank. Meredith Stokes, the woman who'd seemed so eager to help, who'd provided detailed federal law enforcement procedures. She'd been the perfect inside source for Butler. But why would she betray them? Marshall thought back to her financial situation, her access to information, her convenient expertise. A librarian's salary in a small town wouldn't buy much loyalty when Butler came offering alternatives. Eugene's voice crackled over the radio. Marshall, what's the plan? Change of plans. Butler knows everything about our operation, which means he's prepared for us. But he's also made a crucial mistake. What mistake? He's gotten emotional, taking hostages, making public broadcasts. These aren't the actions of a careful criminal. He's acting like a man who's lost control. Marshall drove toward Butler's compound, but not to surrender. Instead, he was conducting final reconnaissance while formulating a new plan that accounted for both federal arrival and Butler's escalating instability. The compound sat on 50 acres of wooded land, with a main house, several outbuildings, and multiple access points to the tunnel network. Butler's security was tighter than usual. Marshall counted at least 12 armed men in defensive positions. But Butler's anger had made him predictable. By taking hostages and making demands, he'd cornered himself in his own stronghold. And Marshall had learned long ago that cornered enemies often defeated themselves. His phone rang with another call from Colonel Mueller. Noble, we're tracking radio chatter from your area. What's the situation? Butler's taken hostages and made public demands. He knows about our investigation, which suggests federal involvement spooked him into accelerating his timeline. Federal backup is still 4 hours out. Then I guess I'll have to improvise, sir. Noble, that's a direct order. Wait for backup. Marshall ended the call and turned off his phone. Sometimes the chain of command got in the way of doing what was necessary. And right now, Deb Delgado didn't have 4 hours to wait for federal politics to sort themselves out. Butler wanted Marshall to come to him alone and unarmed. Instead, he was about to get a visit from someone who'd spent 15 years learning how to turn enemy strongholds into death traps. The war was about to enter its final phase, and Vernon Butler was about to learn why elite warriors didn't take prisoners when their friends were threatened. Chapter 7. The Assault. Marshall had 2 hours before Butler's deadline, but he'd learned that the best time to attack was when the enemy least expected it. Instead of waiting, he decided to strike immediately while Butler's attention was focused on the radio broadcast and public spectacle. His first stop was Eugene's house, where he found the older man cleaning his Vietnam-era service rifle. You can't go in there alone, Eugene said without looking up. I'm not asking you to come with me. Good, because I'm coming whether you ask or not. Deb Delgado helped me rebuild my roof after the last storm. I'm not leaving her to that monster. Marshall studied his ally. Eugene was 71 years old, but his hands were steady and his eyes sharp. More importantly, he knew the local terrain better than anyone. If you're coming, we do this my way. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. Understood. Their first objective was rescuing the hostages. Marshall's reconnaissance had identified 3 possible locations where Butler might be holding Deb: the main house basement, an old root cellar, or one of the equipment sheds. The key was determining which without alerting Butler's security. Using equipment from his consulting firm, Marshall deployed micro-drones to conduct surveillance while he and Eugene approached through the woods. The thermal imaging revealed something interesting. Most of Butler's men were positioned defensively around the main house, but 2 guards were stationed at a seemingly unimportant shed behind the compound. That's where she is, Marshall determined. How do you know? Because Butler's psychological profile suggests he'd want his hostage close enough to monitor, but far enough from his main operations to avoid complications. That shed give him both. Marshall's military training had taught him that successful operations required 3 elements: surprise, overwhelming force, and decisive action. With only 2 men against Butler's security force, surprise would have to compensate for their numerical disadvantage. They began with the guards at the shed. Marshall approached from the north while Eugene created a distraction from the south, a small fire in the woods that drew 1 guard away from his post. Marshall disabled the remaining guards silently, using techniques that ensured the man would wake up with a headache but no permanent damage. Inside the shed, they found Deb Delgado bound but unharmed. Her relief at seeing them was immediately replaced by urgency. "Marshall, there's something you need to know. Butler's not just moving weapons and people tonight. He's moving enough explosives to level half the town." Explosives? I overheard him talking to his men. He's planning to blow the tunnels if he gets cornered. Says he'd rather destroy everything than lose control. Marshall's tactical assessment shifted dramatically. Butler wasn't just a criminal. He was a potential mass murderer willing to commit suicide rather than face justice. Where are the explosives? Main house basement, according to what I heard. But Marshall, there's something else. Meredith Stokes isn't the traitor. What do you mean? Butler's been monitoring our radio communications somehow. He knew about our meetings because he was listening to everything we said. Marshall cursed himself for not considering electronic surveillance. Butler's corruption of local law enforcement would have given him access to radio scanning equipment, possibly even cell phone monitoring capabilities. "We need to get you to safety," Marshall told Deb. "No, I'm staying to help finish this. Mrs. Delgado, that man destroyed my husband, threatened my children, and kidnapped me from my own driveway. I'm not running away when we finally have a chance to stop him." Marshall recognized the steel in her voice, the same resolve he'd seen in combat when ordinary people decided to fight for something bigger than themselves. "Then we'll need to move fast. Eugene, can you get Deb to a safe position where she can coordinate with federal backup when they arrive?" "What about you? I'm going to end this before Butler can detonate those explosives." Marshall's approach to the main house required everything he'd learned about asymmetric warfare. Butler's men were positioned to repel a direct assault, but they weren't prepared for someone who understood how to turn a defensive position into a trap. Using smoke grenades and strategic placement of flashbangs, Marshall created chaos that forced Butler's security team to abandon their prepared positions. In the confusion, he infiltrated the main house through a second-story window while Butler's men searched for attackers who seemed to be everywhere at once. The house's interior revealed the full scope of Butler's paranoia. Security cameras covered every angle, weapons were staged throughout the rooms, and reinforced doors suggested he'd been preparing for a siege. Marshall found Butler in his study, frantically destroying documents while shouting orders over a radio to subordinates who were too busy dealing with the external chaos to respond effectively. "Hello, Vernon," Marshall said quietly. Butler spun around, his face cycling through surprise, fear, and rage before settling on cold calculation. "Marshall Noble, I wonder when you'd finally grow a backbone. Let's talk about those explosives." Butler's smile was unsettling. "Already too late. Timer's running. In 20 minutes, this entire compound and everything in a half-mile radius gets wiped off the map." Marshall's blood chilled. A half-mile radius would include parts of the town, including residential areas. You'd kill innocent people to protect your operation? I'd kill everyone in this pathetic town before I let you destroy what I've built. Marshall realized he was facing something worse than a criminal. He was confronting a true sociopath who viewed human lives as expendable resources in his personal war. The final confrontation was about to begin, and the stakes had just become higher than Marshall had ever imagined. Chapter 8: The Reckoning. "Where's the timer?" Marshall demanded, his voice deadly calm. Butler laughed, the sound carrying an edge of madness. "Even if I told you, you'd never disarm it in time. I learned from military demolitions experts, the kind who don't leave room for heroic saves." Marshall's eyes swept the room, cataloging exits, potential weapons, and Butler's positioning. The man was standing near a desk covered with communication equipment, probably maintaining contact with his remaining men. 20 minutes is longer than you think, Vernon, especially when you don't have friends coming to help. What do you mean? Your security team is currently dealing with what they think is a coordinated federal assault. Eugene's very good at creating noise and confusion. Your men are scattered, confused, and cut off from each other. Butler's confidence wavered slightly. "You're bluffing." "Am I? When's the last time you heard from Kenny Nicholson? Or any of your lieutenants?" Butler grabbed his radio, but only static answered his calls. Marshall had been systematically jamming their communications while Eugene created the illusion of a much larger attacking force. "It's over, Vernon. Your operation is finished. Your men are surrendering to federal agents. And you're going to tell me where that timer is located?" "Never." Butler reached for a pistol on his desk, but Marshall was faster. The confrontation ended quickly. Marshall's SEAL training included extensive hand-to-hand combat, and Butler, despite his military background, hadn't maintained his skills. Within seconds, Butler was on the ground, his weapon across the room. "The timer, Vernon. Now, go to hell." Marshall's training also included advanced interrogation techniques, but he didn't need them. Butler's psychological profile suggested a different approach. "Your mother knows everything," Marshall said quietly. Butler's defiance cracked. "What?" "One has been documenting your activities for years. Photos, dates, license plates, everything. She's the one who gave us the intelligence we needed to bring you down." "You're lying. She told me something interesting about your father. How he'd be ashamed of what you've become. How you've dishonored everything he died fighting for." Butler's face went white. "Don't you dare talk about my father. He was Special Forces, wasn't he? Died protecting innocent people. And his son grew up to traffic and murder those same innocents." "Shut up. What would he think of you now, Vernon? What would he say about a son who threatens old women and children? Who plants bombs under family homes?" Butler broke. "Basement. Sub-basement level, behind the water heater. Digital timer with a tamper switch. You've got 16 minutes. Marshall was already moving. He bound Butler securely and grabbed the radio to contact Eugene. "Status report. Federal backup just arrived. Real ones this time. They're rounding up Butler's men, but Marshall, they found something in the tunnels." "What?" 17 women and girls. Victims of the trafficking operation. They're alive, but barely. Marshall's resolve hardened as he descended into the basement. Butler's evil had touched far more lives than they'd realized. The sub-basement was a maze of storage rooms and mechanical equipment. Marshall found the timer exactly where Butler had indicated, a sophisticated device with multiple redundancies and, as promised, a tamper switch that would detonate immediately if handled incorrectly. 14 minutes remaining. Marshall studied the device carefully. His SEAL training included bomb disposal, but this was military-grade equipment requiring specialized knowledge. Fortunately, he recognized the model, something he'd encountered during overseas operations. The key was patience. Butler had been right about one thing. This wasn't designed for heroic last-second saves. It required methodical disarmament following specific procedures. 8 minutes remaining. Marshall began the delicate process of neutralizing each component. Cut the wrong wire, remove the wrong panel, and the device would detonate immediately with enough force to level several city blocks. For minutes remaining, his hands moved with surgical precision, guided by training and experience. Each component had to be addressed in sequence, with electronic safety checks confirming successful disarmament at each stage. 2 minutes remaining. The final component was the most dangerous, a motion sensor designed to trigger detonation if the device was moved after arming. Marshall had to maintain perfect stillness while disconnecting circuits that were deliberately placed in awkward positions. 30 seconds remaining. Marshall's training had taught him that panic was the enemy of precision. He controlled his breathing, steadied his hands, and made the final disconnection with 5 seconds to spare. The timer stopped. Marshall sat back against the wall, allowing himself a moment of relief before grabbing his radio. Eugene, this is Marshall. Explosives neutralized. Butler's in custody. What's the status with the victims? Paramedics are treating them now. Federal agents are documenting everything. Marshall, it's over. We won. As Marshall made his way back upstairs, he found Butler slumped in the chair where he'd left him. The man who'd terrorized an entire town looked broken, deflated. It's finished, Vernon, Marshall said. Your trafficking victims are being rescued, your weapons shipments are confiscated, and your network is being dismantled. Federal agents are probably arresting your corrupt contacts as we speak. Butler looked up with empty eyes. You have no idea what you've done. I was protecting this town. From what? From worse things than me. You think I'm bad? Wait until you see who moves in to fill the vacuum. Marshall studied Butler's face, searching for deception. But the man seemed genuinely convinced of his own narrative. That's not our problem anymore. That's a problem for legitimate law enforcement. As federal agents took Butler into custody, Marshall stood in the compound's main room surveying the operation they'd just concluded. 17 trafficking victims rescued. Enough weapons to supply a small army confiscated. A network of corruption spanning multiple government agencies exposed. But it was the personal cost that weighed on him. Deb Delgado would recover physically, but the psychological trauma would last longer. Eugene's quiet satisfaction couldn't mask the exhaustion of a man who'd finally seen justice for his community. Amber Mayer faced an uncertain future as a federal witness. And Wanda Ramos would have to live with the knowledge that her son had become everything his father had died fighting against. Sometimes victory felt as complicated as defeat. But Marshall knew that some fights were worth winning, regardless of the cost. Vernon Butler's reign of terror was over. Now, the community could begin the long process of healing. Chapter 9. Justice and New Beginnings. 3 months after Vernon Butler's arrest, Marshall stood in his backyard watching his children play in the garden Jenny had planted. The sounds of laughter and normalcy felt strange after the intensity of their war against Butler's criminal empire. The federal trials had concluded with decisive results. Butler received multiple life sentences for human trafficking, weapons trafficking, conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism, and 17 counts of kidnapping. His network of corruption had been systematically dismantled, with Sheriff Damon Espinoza, Mayor Beth Mays, and Judge Herman Hodge all facing federal charges. Eugene approached through the yard, moving with the contentment of a man who'd finally seen justice served. "How's Mrs. Ramos doing?" Marshall asked. "Better than expected. She's been visiting Butler in federal prison. Says she wants to understand how her son became what he became. That takes courage. Wanda's always had that. She's also been working with the federal task force to help other families of criminals understand their options." Marshall nodded. Wanda had turned her private tragedy into a public service, helping other mothers recognize warning signs before their children cross lines they couldn't uncross. What about the trafficking victims? 17 women and girls have been reunited with their families or placed in protective services. The youngest was 14, a runaway from Chicago whose parents thought she was dead. The scope of Butler's evil still amazed Marshall. The man had built his empire on human suffering, treating people like commodities to be bought and sold. Jenny emerged from the house, carrying iced tea and wearing the relaxed expression of someone who'd reclaimed her sense of safety. "Amber's on the phone," she told Marshall. "The FBI wants to know if you're interested in consulting on similar cases." Marshall considered the offer. His security firm was thriving thanks to his enhanced reputation, but part of him missed the clarity of purpose he'd found in fighting Butler. What did you tell her? That you'd think about it. But Marshall, you've done enough. This family deserves some peace. She was right, of course. But Marshall also knew that Vernon Butler hadn't been unique. There were other predators in other towns, building similar empires of fear and corruption. The skills he developed fighting Butler could help other communities that lack the resources to fight back. I'll consider it on a case-by-case basis, he decided. But only situations where local law enforcement can't or won't act. Jenny smiled, understanding that her husband would never be completely content with pure domesticity. Just promise me you'll be careful. Always am. Eugene chuckled. Careful? Marshall, you infiltrated a fortified compound, disarmed military-grade explosives, and single-handedly dismantled a criminal organization that had controlled this town for 15 years. All very carefully planned. Marshall insisted with a grin. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Josh Ramsey, who'd been reinstated as a state trooper and promoted to detective. His investigation of Butler's network had uncovered connections spanning multiple states. Thought you'd want to know, Josh said. We found the source of Butler's weapons. Military contractor with connections to several hate groups. Federal task force is moving on them next week. Any connection to the domestic terror plot? Prevented, thanks to the intelligence you provided. The federal building in Chicago has upgraded security, and 3 terror cells have been arrested. Marshall felt satisfaction at the broader implications of their local victory. Butler's defeat had rippled outward, preventing attacks that would have cost innocent lives. There's something else, Josh continued. The town council wants to give you some kind of medal or recognition. Public ceremony, maybe a key to the city. Absolutely not, Marshall said immediately. What we did was necessary, but it wasn't heroic. It was just people standing up to a bully who'd gotten too comfortable. The town disagrees. You save lives, Marshall. A lot of them. Marshall understood the community's desire to honor what they'd accomplished, but public recognition felt wrong. Heroes worked within the system. What they'd done had required operating outside it. Tell the council I appreciate the thought, but the real heroes are the people who chose to fight back instead of accepting the status quo. Eugene, Amber, Deb, even Wanda, they're the ones who deserve recognition. As the afternoon wore on, neighbors began arriving for an impromptu gathering that had become a weekly tradition. Deb Delgado brought homemade pie, still showing signs of her ordeal, but growing stronger each week. Glenn Reed and his wife contributed grilled burgers, their hardware store now thriving without Butler's protection fees. Even Meredith Stokes attended, having been cleared of any wrongdoing in Butler's betrayal. The discovery that Butler had been monitoring their radio communications explained how he'd learned about their plans. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if you hadn't moved here, Deb said to Marshall as they watched the children play. Someone else would have stood up eventually, Marshall replied. Butler's mistake was thinking fear would keep people quiet forever. You really believe that? Marshall looked around at the faces of his neighbors. People who'd found courage they didn't know they possessed, who'd risked everything to reclaim their community. I know it, he said firmly. As the sun set over their small town, Marshall felt something he hadn't experienced since his military service. The deep satisfaction of a mission completed successfully. Butler's empire was destroyed, his victims were safe, and a community had rediscovered its strength. The house on Elm Street that had started as a symbol of Butler's reach had become something else entirely. A reminder that predators only prospered when good people chose to look away. Marshall Noble had come to this town seeking a quiet place to raise his family. Instead, he'd found a fight worth winning and a community worth defending. Sometimes the best battles were the ones fought in your own backyard, protecting the people who mattered most. And sometimes, when you stood up to monsters, you discovered that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary courage. Vernon Butler had learned that lesson too late. But for the town he'd once terrorized, it was just the beginning of a much better story. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.